Hello. I want to welcome you to this presentation and invite you to take notes, ask questions, and feel free to be yourselves during this session. My name is Chandria Wynn Campos, and I wholeheartedly and sincerely welcome you all, as you are, to this information session, Accidental Social Science, a study of classism in academic libraries and information centers. To give you a brief overview of who I am as an individual and professional, my pronouns are she and her, and I am an independent information professional and small business owner. I currently work as a contractor and manage a small pet care business with my partner while utilizing my skills and knowledge as a librarian and archivist to support local nonprofits such as the DeKalb County branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, and my own veteran-owned and operated nonprofit, the Humble Ethical Researchers Company, on behalf of underrepresented community members living with invisible disabilities or struggling due to their socioeconomic status. I'm from Atlanta's West Side. My grandmother and great aunts moved our family from the Atlanta housing projects in Vine City in the 1990s, and we resided in Atlanta until we couldn't anymore. After completing high school and a semester at Georgia State University, I decided to join the United States military to be able to afford the cost of my education, during which time I was diagnosed with an invisible disability. After 6 years, I escaped to libraries from the armed forces, seeking an environment that I, as a Black woman living with an invisible disability, could feel welcome in. As of today, my only positive working experiences within libraries and archives in the state have been as a student employee and a library user. As a lifelong lover of libraries and information professional, I am deeply saddened by and ashamed of the state of our profession, and this presentation will explain why. I'd like to begin by defining some terms I'll be using throughout the session. For the purpose of this presentation, classism is defined as a belief that a person's social or economic station in society determines their value in that society. This one was hard to explain until I found a definition that encompassed all of my experiences as an employee within libraries in one word: dysfunctional. Sociologists, psychologists, and librarians Spencer Acadia and collaborators in their work, Libraries as Dysfunctional Organizations and Workplaces, cite the Concise Dictionary of Business Management's loose definition of dysfunctional as a way of doing things that doesn't work. They also referenced Bad Behavior in Organizations, a review and typology for future research in defining dysfunctional behavior as motivated behavior by an employee or group of employees that is intended to have negative consequences for another individual and/or group and/or the organization itself. These definitions are important because these terms will be used throughout the presentation and encapsulate the current state of our workspaces on a national level, not just a state one. Acadia and librarian and archivist Kendall Vogt discuss how well libraries attend to and manage external information in helping library users, but largely fail at taking care of themselves internally. I agree. As a patron, I have always been satisfied with libraries and information centers, but as a library worker, my experience has been complicated. A media specialist who provided her labor to my elementary school in the 1990s sparked an interest in libraries for me the first time I saw her read a book to one of her kindergarten classes. It set my expectations high for our profession. As a result of her reading techniques and enthusiasm for reading to small children, many children were likely able to excel in reading and language skills enough to confidently navigate the educational system in Georgia. This experience was one of several positive ones I had as a library user. By the time I considered librarianship as a profession, library workers had been fierce advocates and mentors to me throughout my childhood. So when I returned home after my time in service, I sought out libraries as a sanctuary based on my interactions with them as a neurodivergent school media center and public library user from a traditionally underserved community. My first job after college was at a private junior college campus in Oxford, Georgia. Shortly after I started, I enrolled in the Master's of Library and Information Science program at Valdosta State University, hoping to gain job experience as I completed my graduate studies online. I provided my labor to the junior college for about 2 years before systemic dysfunction and dysfunctional behavior forced me to involve the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, to investigate and remedy the situation. I also had to find employment elsewhere shortly before completing my MLIS program while the investigation was underway. I then provided my labor to a public university in Atlanta for a year and a half before systemic dysfunction and disregard encouraged me to seek out an opportunity to utilize my recently acquired MLIS and passion for special collections as a digital archivist for a corporate archive in Duluth. I provided my labor to them for 2 years while meeting requirements to receive my certification as an archivist before encountering systemic workplace dysfunction and dysfunctional behaviors. After the last incidence of dysfunction, I realized that I would likely once again have to find employment elsewhere, likely to avoid experiencing any more instances of dysfunction within Georgia libraries and information centers. A not-so-fun fact regarding my previous slide and a form of workplace dysfunction often seen in libraries: problematic recruiting and hiring practices. A majority of members of hiring committees and supervisors that were surveyed in a 2018 study did not like folks that switch jobs a lot. There is a belief that candidates with this trait are disloyal or uncommitted. However, many academic and public institutions continuously create short-term, part-time positions that library workers cannot stay in due to low pay and no benefits. Wild, right? So let's get into why we're here today. The experiences that I and other library workers like me have endured inspired me to work with others to publicly address what was happening. At one point, I thought that the discriminatory practices, microaggressions, and bullying we observed were a Georgia thing. Well, in a 2021 survey of Georgia library workers conducted by the Georgia Library Association's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, co-chaired by myself and librarian Rob Griggs-Taylor, instances of exclusion in libraries and information centers due to characteristics such as race, ability, gender identity, or sexual orientation were reported by library staff, administrators, and volunteers. Members of the task force recommended that a more permanent agency to address this discrepancy in objectives and professional goals be created within the Georgia Library Association. To be clear, this presentation is not just about the prevalence of discriminatory behavior in our academic libraries. It's also about the known workplace culture of libraries within the United States as a whole. Even without the classism with undertones of racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and other encroachments on the rights of our workers, libraries and information centers are referenced as one of the most toxic working environments in our country by leading researchers in our field and outside of it due to bullying, harassment, and other dysfunctional behaviors and practices within our workspaces. This impacts all of us. This session was designed to share, validate, and incorporate the lived experiences of marginalized librarians and archivists into something meaningful and useful to a new generation of information professionals, students, and researchers who may be subjected to similar experiences in their lifetime. As an information professional from underrepresented and marginalized communities, I feel that I have an obligation to this profession and to my peers to warn new and unsuspecting information professionals of the prevalence of dysfunction within our institutions and how they can and most often will present themselves in our working environments. Using collected data and the lived experiences of library workers and professionals in spaces similar to some of ours over the last 11 years, I've created this presentation to summarize a social science research proposal that will continue the much-needed work of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force and bring attention to the cultural environment in Georgia libraries and information centers as workspaces. The purpose of this work is to continuously document the prevalence of classist actions and other discriminatory ideologies and workplace practices within library workspaces in the state and the Southeast, and apply it in developing practical and effective ways to execute some of the recommendations made by the task force statewide. With all of that being said, I want everyone in attendance to know even more specifics about why we're here and what our goals are. Today, we'll review behavioral trends, patterns, and research findings relevant to our profession's stance on discriminatory workplace practices, specifically those related to classism and othering already marginalized populations. We'll review previous research efforts and findings focused on the facilitation of inclusive and non-discriminatory working environments in academic libraries within the state. We'll recognize unsung heroes of the information profession and library workers who have conducted and contributed to relevant research on belonging, fairness, and non-discriminatory practices in libraries and information centers. And then we'll leave you with some useful information, guidance, and other resources to help you confront, address, and discourage discriminatory and predatory behavior in your workspace should you encounter it. So again, the purpose of the study that this presentation is titled after is to explore how academic libraries in the state of Georgia engage with library workers from underrepresented communities in the modern era of standardized diversity, equity, and inclusivity statements and efforts. I titled it Accidental Social Science because of the events that led me to pursue this research topic. Through observing, experiencing, and actively adapting to different library spaces and supervisors, I was reminded of the work of ethnographers in the anthropology field, studying and taking notes on cultures they studied. An outsider, forcing their way into a culture to better understand it. The objective of the research is to identify the root causes of workplace discrimination in information centers that are fundamentally based in class, ability, and race, and counteract them through tactful confrontation, education, and hopefully well-rounded legislation. This research encompasses qualitative and quantitative exploratory studies paired with ethnographic research methods applied within the field of library and information science. The study will inform academic libraries, among others, in the state of Georgia about alarming trends in how pervasive discriminatory workplace hiring, retention, and professional development practices are in the state. It will also provide library workers with effective ways to challenge and discourage them. The bulk of the statistical data included in this presentation and project was pulled from an online survey that was conducted using Qualtrics software provided by Rob Griggs Taylor during their time with Valdosta State University and refined by members of the Georgia Library Association's Library Services for Persons with Disabilities Interest Group and members of the Georgia Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled, formerly known as Georgia Libraries for Accessible Statewide Services, or GLASS. Input from surveys and research referenced in Spencer Acadia's Libraries as Dysfunctional Organizations and Workplaces, published last year, and E. Fraser Franklin's Black Bourgeoisie, published in 1957, as well as other revolutionary works dedicated to this topic, were referenced. So we should discuss the scope of the EDI task force for context. In 2021, the Georgia Library Association's Executive Committee charged the members of the task force with making specific recommendations for the Georgia Library Association and its units to address issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the organization, within libraries in the state, and the profession. That's a lot. The task force surveyed the GLA members and library workers who were not GLA affiliated during this process and reviewed current literature for recommendations and best practices. Primarily, we wanted to give Georgia Library Association members a place to safely express their hopes, woes, and frustrations with working in Georgia libraries and in the Georgia Library Association. We sought to ensure that accountability, transparency, proactivity, and good faith were embedded in this endeavor. From goals developed by multiple information professionals interested and invested in this work, the task force presented actionable recommendations based on data collected through the online survey that was circulated. Our goals were to develop library staff who were able to think critically and creatively as they pursued their career goals. We also wanted to develop information professionals who were intercultural leaders. We wanted to support Georgia libraries in recruiting and developing more diverse staff that reflected both served and underserved communities, and we wanted to create safe spaces for those diverse staff. We wanted to foster a sense of belonging throughout the organization by being more intentional about creating and promoting affinity groups, and we wanted to support all Georgia libraries in improving accessibility. Task force members designed a mixed method survey for members of the Georgia Library Association and distributed the survey using Qualtrics. Again, the survey was not only restricted to members of the Georgia Library Association, and it was distributed on May 31st of 2021 through several Georgia Library Association listservs and regional social media groups. The survey received 130 complete responses, with none incomplete at the close of the survey period. To contextualize both the respondents' answers to the open-ended questions and to gain an understanding of GLA's membership, roughly half of the survey consisted of demographic questions. I've listed some of the results of the demographic questions on this slide, and you can find more detailed responses and information in the full copy of the survey that could be accessed via the link provided to you in our presentation supplementary material. As you can see here, half of the respondents to the survey identified as white, 31% identified as Black or African American, 60% identified as female, and 14.6% identified as male, while 3.1% identified as non-binary. 34% of respondents identified as administrators and managers, 32% identified as librarians, while 12% identified as staff. We were pleased with the results, but now knowing that there were over 673 librarians registered in the state of Georgia in 2020, I believe, I'd like a chance to get more input, and I'd like to see more representation of staff members because there are obviously way more in this state that aren't represented in this survey. The survey gave the respondents an opportunity to self-identify as a person with disabilities or as members of the LGBTQIA+ community. While most respondents did not identify as a person with disabilities, 16.24% did, and we realized that the survey did not provide respondents with a definition of the term disability, which that will be corrected in future iterations of it. Additionally, 21.3% of respondents indicated that they identified as LGBTQIA+. We explored 6 activities that the Georgia Library Association might use to expand diversity and inclusion in Georgia libraries. Then we asked if respondents would be interested in participating in each activity. Contributing to scholarships had the most enthusiasm, and participating in or supporting advocacy activities was the activity for which the least enthusiasm was evident. We also asked respondents to rank these activities in order of perceived importance for helping to expand diversity and inclusion. This question was asked after the interest question in order not to influence respondents' reporting of their interest. Community outreach activities overall was a top-ranked choice, as it is the top or second activity across all the statistics. Advocacy activities and mentoring events or programs are generally ranked in the middle in importance, although the mean rank for advocacy activities is number 1. Regional networking groups generally ranked near the bottom. Scholarship-related activities were harder to characterize. Like scholarships for paraprofessionals who want to pursue an MLIS degree was near or at the bottom on mean rank and percentage of respondents who ranked at number 1. However, when one takes into account respondents who ranked it first, second, or third, it jumps to the top. Scholarships for MLIS students in marginalized communities is generally at the bottom of the rankings, but has the second highest percentage of respondents who ranked it as number 1 in importance. Based on these responses, we created recommendations and submitted a report to the executive board. Based on open-ended responses and answers to ranking questions, respondents showed a strong willingness to support scholarships for those seeking to pursue a degree in library and information science. In addition, contributing to or supporting scholarships for MLIS students from marginalized communities received a high number of responses. Based on this input, we made our first recommendation. We asked a specific question about mentoring to gauge respondents' interest in being a mentor and their interest in being mentored. Only 45 respondents answered this question, but the results demonstrated potential for a mentoring program, with 57.8% reporting that they would be interested in being mentors and 42.2% saying they're interested in having a mentor. Our second recommendation took this input into consideration. Our third recommendation was based on the open-ended responses from various library workers at differing career levels regarding experiences of exclusion, bullying, and other forms of incivility. The recommendation called for the incorporation of diversity and inclusion images on web pages with recruitment and retention in mind. Diversity, equity, and inclusion information was to also be included on welcome pages for new members. Hosting a system-wide inclusive excellence conference was also an idea, as well as fostering an information exchange between divisions and creating and implementing a DEI scorecard and periodic audit of documentation for language and bias. The task force's fourth recommendation called for the development of a body that was specifically dedicated to building and supporting a diverse library workforce in the state of Georgia. It implied that by visiting communities and recruiting young people into our field, kind of like the Army does, we would support a more diverse workforce. It did the same for developing a checklist for inclusive recruitment practices, which was not done to my knowledge, but I'm still collecting data on our progress over the last 3 years. Our final recommendation was centered on being inclusive of people with disabilities by creating an accessibility resource page listing useful resources and support agencies on the existing Georgia Library Association website. This recommendation also suggested developing a checklist for auditing accessibility in library spaces for accommodating disabled staff and patrons, maintaining accessibility technology equipment lists, tips and training for staff, sponsoring library staff to attend the Georgia Accessibility Conference, and providing training for managing and hiring staff with disabilities. The task force and recommendations, while heartfelt, were an effort that had been initiated countless times by libraries and information professionals around the country, and the results had always been the same: temporary interest, performative overuse of buzzwords and ideas, and eventually complete numbness to the effort and no genuine implementation of it. Isabella Spinell, Tanya Sutherland, and Charlotte Rowe in their work, A Holistic Approach for Inclusive Librarianship, Decentering Whiteness in Our Profession, explicitly states what has not worked is forming committees or writing policies and other documents that are eventually suspended or simply forgotten based on the trends of the organization. Nicole A. Cook, in her work Pushing Back from the Table, Fighting to Maintain My Voice as a Pre-Tenure Minority Female in the White Academy, concluded that while diversity is desirable on paper, it's often resisted in practice. I agree. So was this all for nothing? Not at all. Although no significant promotion or implementation of the recommendations listed within the report are evident, and library workers continue to experience both subtle and blatant acts of incivility in library workspaces, I saw that some of our collaborators were continuing their efforts, and it brought me some reassurance. I wanted to know what the cycle that many of my peers and myself were stuck in was. Was it us? Was it our location? What was this feeling of not belonging we felt, but were constantly told it didn't or couldn't exist? I reviewed my notes. So where are we now, I thought? Based on a review of publications relevant to our organization and members, it looks like we're right where we started. Literature centered on equity, diversity, and inclusion continues to focus on patrons and users, while employers continue to turn a blind eye to the traumatic workspaces we're occupying. But why? Several reasons. All the reasons fall under the umbrella of workplace dysfunction, and the most documented ones are listed here. While they aren't the focus of this session, low morale, burnout, and turnover are worth mentioning for awareness. Academic libraries perpetuate many practices that foster these symptoms of workplace dysfunction in their employees. The do more with less, deal with it approaches that we celebrate and pat ourselves on the back for crafting aren't effective long-term, and they place the responsibility of making meaningful change onto individual employees after budget cuts and layoffs force us to work with less to accomplish more for our organizations. Problematic recruitment, retention, and hiring practices are also prevalent symptoms of our profession's dysfunction. According to Spencer, recruiting and hiring practices in the LIS profession are problematic and have been for quite some time. Another not so fun fact, research conducted by research and instruction librarian Eamon Tewell in 2012 showed that the most successful candidates for entry-level library jobs weren't those directly out of library school, but those who had several years of working library experience. Another thing that's, a sign and symptom of dysfunction is discrimination and a lack of workforce diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has been and still is a hallmark of our profession. I include information centers and historically Black colleges and universities in this assessment as well. In their 2016 work, Workplace Bullying, A Silent Epidemic, academic librarian Jennifer A. Bartlett describes bullying in libraries as a silent epidemic. Incivility, harassment, and bullying are often paired with discriminatory ideology or unconscious biases and seems to affect a majority of library environments, especially in American academic and public libraries, according to research conducted by Shen Friedman and Don Vrerin in 2016. Due to the popularity of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts within our field, the next few slides will briefly cover the history of discrimination within our profession based in class, gender, race, and ability. I'll do my best to hit some highlights relevant to our state in the Southeast. Due to increasing awareness surrounding people living with invisible disabilities, we now have a wider breadth of research to reference than we did in 2021. I'd like to start with the experience of a notable Black female librarian, Virginia Lacey Jones. In 1970, she recalled the arrangements of the 1935 American Library Association conference meeting held in Richmond, Virginia, where Florence Curtis, the first dean of Hampton Institute's library school and a speaker, shepherded a group of her students into certain inequality. Black students were sequestered in each room and were not permitted to view the exhibit at the host hotel. Jones was able to pass as a white woman during the occasion. She stayed at the hotel and viewed the exhibit. Later, she confessed that she had mixed feelings about doing so and felt a sense of shame for being dishonest and pretending to be what she wasn't and going where she wasn't wanted. On the other hand, she also felt a sense of triumph in outsmarting the blatant and cruel racial discrimination that she experienced. An American Library Association special committee appointed by the executive board cleared the ALA from wrongdoing. The organization, they reasoned, neither imposed nor approved the restrictions in Richmond, and in 1940, the Committee on Racial Discrimination examined the issue. A number of librarians protested the reconsideration, including Chicago Public Library's Agatha Shee, Hampton-Sydney College's Frank C. Winston, and Southern Methodist University's Dorothy Amon. About 15 years later, the Georgia Library Association refused to adhere to the American Library Association's requirement for libraries in southern states to integrate in the mid-1950s. Some state library organizations complied, while others, like the state of Georgia, stood alongside Mississippi and Alabama in continuing to refuse membership to librarians of color and lost its ALA representation. Many notable librarians cited not wanting to rock the boat as their cause for standing on the sidelines. Throughout this time frame, Black librarians in the South were making space for excellent people of color. Unfortunately, many of the heroes we laud as facilitators of the inclusion of Black and brown people in receiving library services were simultaneously perpetuating the ideologies of white Puritan conservatives that had invested in Black educational institutions for their own gains. The impact of this foundation cannot be underestimated. The Freedmen's Bureau, with the help of several religious organizations, established Atlanta University, Fisk University, and Howard University for the purpose of educating African Americans. They taught up to secondary level, I believe. Hampton Institute and the Tuskegee Institute, two other colleges created to educate Black folks, were industrial schools that were primarily focused on teaching technical skills. The librarians and educators at these institutions were limited in what they could teach and promote due to the time period and their sponsors. teaching subordination as respectability and providing reading materials that encouraged assimilation to poor people of color. They were unwittingly advancing the agenda of Northern institutions that were invested in the subjugation of Black people. Social scientist E. Franklin Frazier does an excellent job of describing the state of educators, including librarians, at historically Black colleges and universities in his 1957 publication, Black Bourgeoisie. His chapter on higher education in African American communities provides a glimpse into how pervasive classism is in all of our spaces. Beyond the scope of just alienating people of color because of their socioeconomic status or racial identity, academic libraries have historically excluded people with disabilities through their workplace practices. Library workers who identify as disabled face issues such as dealing with colleagues and supervisors who are uncomfortable with their disability, or reluctance to discuss or disclose their disability at work, or a reluctance to ask for workplace accommodations, even though we're legally entitled to it. Although libraries show an interest in creating library services for users with disabilities, we failed at creating welcoming and inclusive spaces for workers experiencing disabilities. Take the story of librarian and independent scholar Anita Saraka from Too Many Spoons, Library Workers with Disabilities. In her first public library job, the branch supervisor didn't like her displays of initiative. She didn't like that she was a page who was going the extra mile to help patrons. She didn't like that she was a page who was experiencing a disability that caused her physical pain, but was able to get shelving work done quickly and correctly. And she initially was just very, hostile towards her in her efforts to show that she had initiative. When Anita explained her disability to her supervisor, she was told that it was nonsense and that someone so young couldn't suffer from such a disorder. Although it was explained that this library system, like many, has hierarchy-based systems that dictate which employees can and can't do certain activities and work, there was nothing said about her supervisor fighting with her about her disability and accusing her of lying. I think she said that her other colleagues, except for one person, didn't believe that she was actually disabled. So within the 2021 GLA report cited earlier, some open-ended responses regarding how students with disabilities are perceived stood out to me after reading this. The response reads, "I've been working with my college's Student Disability Services Department for over a year now. When a person has an invisible disability, like a learning disability, depression, etc., faculty are resistant to, if not hostile about, providing accommodations for these students. They believe the student is cheating by being granted assistance. There is still a lot of education that librarians can do to help these individuals." How are we to aid library users with disabilities if we are incapable of helping ourselves? Of note for this portion of the presentation is the lack of availability of statistical data regarding transgender and non-binary individuals pursuing careers in our field. Many members of the LGBTQIA+ community feel that they have to censor themselves in order to avoid discrimination, retribution, and abuse. In his work, Recruiting and Retaining LGBTQ-Identified Staff in Academic Libraries Through Ordinary Methods, academic librarian Elliot Cooker shone a light onto the lack of attention to the needs and experiences of LGBTQ-identified librarians that further emphasizes that the library profession, though it claims to strive for diversity, is doing nothing to explicitly recruit or retain them. What does all of this have to do with classism in academic libraries? Everything. The issues that the hierarchical structure of academic institutions and other library types traditionally promotes and prefers, paired with the societal issues prevalent in our state, negatively impact our ability to maintain library workers from marginalized communities seeking upward mobility. And you know what? There are inherently no protections from discriminatory workplace practices for library workers from both underrepresented and represented communities. This can be handled by moving forward together and addressing the underlying causes of this constant and pervasive problem of inequity, lack of diversity, and exclusion based on discriminatory behaviors that are amplified by our organizational structures. There are multiple things we as information professionals can do to protect ourselves from the silent epidemic of dysfunction in our workplaces. For one, we can call it what it is: workplace abuse. By giving this phenomenon a name, we can better communicate with one another about the silent epidemic of bullying, harassment, and psychological abuse within our spaces. If that doesn't encourage you to get with a trusted peer and chat about your experiences, maybe this will. Spencer Acadia cited a lack of communication as a cause of workplace dysfunction in libraries and other information centers. So read the room and find an ally or ask someone if they're okay. Another option is actually taking action. The Workplace Psychological Safety Act was introduced by End Workplace Abuse in 2023 to counteract the practices and behaviors described earlier in this presentation. By banding together and demanding a change based on the results of our efforts to better understand and address workplace abuse, we can make libraries and archives safe spaces for users and employees. Again, we are one of the most toxic working environments in the country, and our struggle is known as a silent epidemic. We need to speak up. End Workplace Abuse's goal is to protect and promote workers' rights to psychological wellness by advocating for the elimination of bullying and mobbing from the American workplace. We can aid them in this mission by organizing and leading a collective movement within our profession, one that desperately needs this type of legislation to protect its workers. Through lobbying for protective legislation policies, building true leaders who campaign for abuse-free workplaces, raising public understanding about psychological harm at work, and collaborating with other organizations to advance workers' rights, we can help lead the charge in tackling bias and prejudice that are enmeshed in workplace abuse. Together, we have the power to advocate for strong protections and actual implementation of the thing we create all those roundtables, task forces, and conferences about: equity, diversity, and inclusion. Workplace bullying and the institutional complicity of disregarding bullying complaints to avoid liability are psychosocial hazards that violate an employee's basic human rights, according to End Workplace Abuse. The National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health defines psychosocial hazards as factors in a work environment that can cause stress, strain, or interpersonal problems for the worker, and defines bullying as unwanted harmful actions that humiliate, offend, harm, undermine, or degrade, and can cause lasting physical and psychological damage. Unsafe work environments exploit employees. Our current anti-discrimination laws do not protect library workers from workplace psychological abuse, and proven intent doesn't work with anti-discrimination law, and it doesn't work with mistreatment in general. Proving intent is what's being taught when folks say to document everything if you're experiencing discriminatory treatment. Frequently, employers don't enforce their own policies or practice what they preach about training, and they even retaliate against those who report abuse. So, what can we do about this besides creating presentations and one-shot efforts to put band-aids on it? We can demand that action be taken. A petition is being circulated that will be addressed to all 50 governors in the United States and the mayor of Washington, D.C. You can sign it in support of this legislation. You can also read up on and share the information associated with this effort to improve our workplaces with the fact sheet provided in the link on this slide. It details the purpose of the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. You could also post flyers about this effort in spaces where employees are abused frequently, but be sure to observe ordinances around flyer posting. If you want to be even more involved, you can also reach out to me or the team lead for the End Workplace Abuse team in Georgia to become a member of the efforts to combat workplace abuse or library dysfunction or whatever else you want to call it. Because this work can result in re-trauma for yourself and others, we ask that you wait until the abuse no longer affects your day-to-day living before reaching out. Listed here are some of the themes and sessions from the conferences held by the Georgia Library Association and the Society of Georgia Archivists over the last 4 years. We as a profession continue to vocalize wanting to be more inclusive and fair in our spaces. This year's conference theme is Leading Georgia Forward Together, and I love it, but our actions within our workspaces towards one another don't match the theme. Looking away, pretending it's all right, saying, better you than me, ain't it? As information professionals, we have a lot of responsibility on us, and the bare minimum should be respect for one another and the field we chose. References included in this presentation are still being added to the working draft that you can access through this link. The document you will have viewing access to is a working draft that includes portions of the abstract and methodology of this research. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns about the content of this presentation, please do not hesitate to contact me at sean.wynn@humbleresearch.org. If you would like more information on how you can support End Workplace Abuse's push to pass the Workplace Psychological Safety Act on a state and federal level, such as how to write your local legislators, join the Georgia team, advocating for this bill, or sharing your story of workplace abuse in Georgia in a confidential and supportive space, please hit me up. Thank you for your time and for attending this virtual session.